There's not really much of a silver lining with what's going on in AI and music. One thing I did realize though, and I wanted to make this video kind of in several parts because this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. One thing I just realized though is so the whole point of being a musician composer is the control that you have over the composition and the production if you're a producer, etc. So I just realized that there is no input on this. So what that means is you won't be involved in like the creative process. I mean, I'm sure that there's like subtle things you can do to kind of mix it up and make things change in certain ways and intervene. But the actual music production and creative process is nothing like that. It's nothing like taking something that's already done and then kind of, messing with it. That's more like just production or engineering. But we're just talking about, music creation as a whole here. And so what that does is it closes the actual creative process. So while it makes a very good simulation, it's more like, instead of like a creative work, it's a hodgepodge and a simulation of previously done works. And I'm sure that eventually, and probably some of software already does this, it will create new forms of music, because the whole thing with music is the new forms. And so kind of thinking about this, like in the 70s, people were all about progressive music and they were mixing in classical because they thought that this was virtuoso and this was progressive to mix these things, because classical had this open-ended quality where you could get away from the basic song structure. So you could go from all these crazy chord combinations. You could implement jazz, you could implement classical, you could implement crazy drum breaks and crazy tempo gyrations and tempo changes. So all this stuff that is happening with AI is essentially taking the emotional aspect out of the creative process of music making. And so that's kind of important because we as humans are steering the designs of the things we do with an intended purpose. But there's two segments to what's happening in the music industry. And as a pretty experienced person in some aspects of the music industry, it's really split down the middle between the purest musicians who do it for the love of music, which is quite a few, but then it's split between those people and then the people who are sort of mixed and headed towards the commercial side of things, which is all what AI is about, at least right now. Because you have to ask yourself also, why was AI even created for music? And the whole point of it is essentially so that places like Google and these other companies, these other tech companies, didn't have to pay royalties and potentially could make royalties from the content that's generated or have some means of income, but essentially to save all these millions and millions of dollars on royalties. And so one thing I realized that when the power structure changes its methodology, it does what's called a creative destruction. And I noticed this a long time ago, but it's reemerging again. And so what's happening here is, people are looking around and they're saying they can't really be breaking all these models, and that's exactly what they're doing. So if you're a software designer, if you work at Logic Audio for Apple, if you work at Steinberg, what's going to happen here is a shift where they're implementing the AI, and they already have been, in subtle ways. But eventually, to keep pace with what's happening, they have to go full swoop and then implement the entire concept in all levels of the system. So what we're really talking about here also is what the novelty of music is. So one thing is on the business side, you're breaking all of these economic structures. So you're interrupting the structure of like the Apples and the Steinbergs and the Alvedons and the Fruity Loops. All of that is going to be interrupted. Now there's still like a huge amount of hobbyism in the music sector, and most of it is like, now it's like you have your day job and you do music, and if you make a nickel, you're very blessed, So, and that's because big tech really already destroyed that because they're not really what they seem. They're just an extension of the power structure. And so the whole point of the system has been to get people to get online and to be able to, have these sophisticated new systems of economics. And so we're sort of reaching the peak of that transition, and it's very ugly. And we're sweeping under the rug all of the issues of homelessness, the real issues that actually are existing, the people who are living in this sort of state of perpetual catching up with bills and going bankrupt and going homeless and all these things. We're sort of sweeping a lot of that under the rug. These are very real problems. And the people that are like making it right now are faking it to make it because they're in debt, their economic situation's ruined because people can't sustain in a double inflation market. And the market has not corrected itself in terms of the day-to-day things you buy for many years. Because it went up during the 2019 period and it stayed up and it stayed weird. It just stayed unsettlingly weird. So all of this is the power structure itself, culminating in this idea to push people to this new economic paradigm. So we don't really have, a choice in this, and the private sector is behind this drive to push AI, obviously, but the people who just enjoy music as a love of labor of love, they're like myself, or just purists who will always be interested in doing it. It's like you don't start a rose garden because you think you're going to become a famous rich gardener. And I gave up on the idea of fame and fortune while I was in California because. First of all, I never actually wanted that, but I understood that there was a thing of that in the industry where you're either at the top of the game and making the lion's share, or you're in a lot of trouble. And I fell into the category of you're in a lot of trouble because they don't really want a middle class, artist. And that's because when you're in the upper echelon, you're serving a dual purpose, and the dual purpose helps them facilitate this whole system of the power structure. So without going into excruciating detail about all that stuff, which is totally going to be a waste of time, what we're dealing with here is that AI as music was created by the power structure essentially to save money and to thwart this whole industry. So you're talking about also people who would pick up a guitar. They're going to put it down now. And people who pick up a piano, and they're going to put it down now. But the power structure doesn't necessarily care about that because they're moving towards this new agenda of, the lower carbon footprints, a new digitized version of the economic system. And there really is a great thinning of the herd, and none of us really none of us knows who's going to end up, on the winning side of that, or just like being totally cast aside. And what happens is you think you're going to be on the winning side of it, or you're going to be spared, but it eventually makes its way to you. So just like with the AI music, people thought that they had an opportunity to keep going in this same fashion for a very long time, but now it's already here, within, a couple of years instead of, 10 years or 20 years down the line. So anyways, another aspect of this is the music industry has been a mess for many years, 20, 30, 40, for many years. It's been a mess, and it should have been looked into why the structure is such a mess, but they intentionally did not want that. So that was stopped by the power structure, who actually used the music industry in a lot of ways. And since they don't need to do that anymore, what's happening is a lot of things that were like the way of the power structure, which were just created by the power structure to support its facade, they're all going to go away. So while it feels like it's heartbreaking if this was, your way to make a couple extra bucks, it was never actually a real thing. And I'm a person who experienced this firsthand, finding out that there's this giant fake part of the music flow of money. and it's a huge problem, but it's a problem that they intentionally don't want to fix. So when you go and you try to do anything to address or regress anything that's been done to you or any wrongs that have occurred to you, you can't do anything because you're barking up the wrong tree and you're biting the hand that feeds and you're going against essentially, ultimately, the way of the world, the way that the power structure wanted to erect the system. So, besides the issues of copyright, the one thing I'll mention about that is the music industry has run on not giving a flying hoot about copyright for a very long time. And if they did, that would be another problem for musicians, because most musicians now have been making, some kind of employment or some kind of gain from sounding like somebody else or something else, or going after the branding stuff. And that's again because the private interests, the power structure, the corporate system likes to play it safe, and they create the style. Musicians don't create the style. And so, like, even somebody who was incredibly cool, like Michael Jackson, he didn't dream that stuff up. He was a product of all this machinery. He worked with the greatest musicians and the greatest producers and some great surrounding people who helped him culminate in this incredible, virtuosity. And he got to, appreciate the ego boost from being a huge part of that and being an incredible vocalist, one-of-a-kind vocalist. But at the same time, if you look at like all the people who like mimic him and get very close, you can see that there's actually people who are similar. I mean, they're never going to match that, and because he had the opportunity to cast that brand, so it always feels like no matter how good they would get, they would feel like a knockoff. So, in this way, the people don't really see at first glance how the flows of the system create these sort of idols. And so he was a creation of that, and they didn't need that stuff anymore because they've changed the model. So you're seeing also simultaneously Hollywood changing in a lot of ways, obviously. And you're seeing all this changes happening that seems bizarre and unfair, but what's really happening is the power structure is changing how the model works. And so it's a thing that's affecting everything in every capacity of life. And people who are not aware, like the influence, or about the influence that the power structure has had over society. And when I'm talking about the power structure, I'm not talking about the government, because the government is not the power structure. The power structure is essentially the private sector, which is the empire, which is this international system of business. Some may say globalism. But, it's the point of it is it's always been around for a very long time, since like organized society, when it kind of split in half between people who wanted to vote and have a consensus vote to build a government versus people who thought other people were either to be exploited or to be avoided, or they were stupid, so they formed their own system. So society went in two very different directions. And the one that's private didn't have the issue of loyalty toward the local areas. So they learned the ability to appropriate and exploit, and some may use the word colonize, everything in the world. So even if you became the greatest musician in the world, you would be appropriated, and also you're using the byways of their machinery, so you're still doing it with their technologies, their permission. So that's sort of where we are with this, and that nobody's really talking about that side of it. They all want to freak out about, how it's just now an issue. For me, the music industry has been an issue since my father died, broke, after going to Juilliard. And, when you graduate that, prestigious university and you don't get success after that, and a lot of people don't, all you hear about is the people who are successful. What's wrong with the system? And so I went in another direction, and I got to see different aspects of what could be wrong with the system. But again, it led to this issue of it doesn't work the way people think. And that's why it could survive in a post-Napster world when there's nothing being made from money. From music. Nothing's being made from streaming rates. So you have this giant sub-industry that's producing some money for people, but it's a very shady industry. And I'm not even going to name what that industry is. You can kind of guess. But there's many sectors of the music industry that don't involve just releasing albums. We'll put it that way. And so it's like anything with the arts, when there's vast flows of money, you have to really wonder about the integrity of that, mechanical process of that structure. So I stopped wondering a long time ago, and I gave up on this idea of an industry of integrity, and I just create music out of the joy of having that garden. It's so funny because one of my favorite bands was called Soundgarden, and only here in 2024, I'm really getting an eye for what that means. It means, this is my version of my little creative input. So for a person like me, I would never want to use AI. And if I did, it would be more like a sprinkle here and a sprinkle there, or maybe to do something tedious that's engineering related, or maybe to do something just tedious in general, okay? So it's more like an automation, or maybe some kind of randomization component, but not as like the whole thing. And so right now, the people who are using it as the whole thing, that's been done like that because people in the private sector, again, wanted to have a way to get the material to be just good enough so that they could create films and they could do all these things without having to worry about paying residuals or any kind of additional money. And so again, that's a whole thing of like how the power structure is changing form. So originally they needed that because they needed the money to go all over the place and to come out nice and clean. But now with the push toward the digital currencies and the push toward the digital paradigm and a whole new system, social credit scores worldwide, a world connected through digital economics worldwide, through the social credit sharing and all that, through more tracking and things like this, everything will change. I honestly don't know if it'll be for the better or for the worse. And I honestly, I've had my share of dark opinions and dark feelings about it because I don't trust the system in play. And so I worry when the system in play, the power structure in play, when they already gypped me off and they gypped my father off and they gyp off a lot of people that I know in the music industry especially, I worry how could they ever build something nice? And so my only thinking is that hopefully with enough technological intelligence that you could build a real government that actually does quantify the vote of the will of the people, because we have never had that. Because what happens instead is the systems erect people of well-to-do surroundings so that they can do the bidding of the people who put them in the position to be elected. It's called a barrier to entry, but we're not dealing with real law anymore for a very long time because we're dealing with a split system because of finance. Because the financial system has been a train wreck for a very long time, and people have not wanted to do anything about it because what happens is you're either good enough at certain things that you join the other half of it that benefits from it, or you don't make it and you just you struggle your whole life, or you end up somewhere in the middle, but eventually run out of steam and go one direction or the other. But what happens a lot is because things are so sophisticated now, you're sort of pushed in either direction. You're either going to go down or you're going to go up, but you're not going to linger in the middle unless you're one of the very, very few. So this is some thoughts about AI, but see, you can't just talk about AI music because it's a bigger structure that's changing. The entire world is going through this shift, and it's sort of slipping through the arts initially because it's one way to make a profit and to save money in the near term, and to help implement and push and kick the can down the road in some ways, but also push the agenda to digitize the system so that you'll have less need to do the world tours, to do the physical stuff that requires emissions and all this, because it speaks to another issue that I can't really get into, because there are things happening with climate that are part of this agenda by the power structure, and that plays a key role in why they want to limit the activities of peoples. So I think there'll be a massive reduction in population. I think there'll be a massive reduction in activities of people. I think that there's going to be a vast, buildup of stimulating things that have to do with things that are in your local proximity, unless somebody develops methods to sort of control emissions or whatever, or have the ability to go from one place to another without creating too much of an impact on the weathering system, because it's really about weather. It's about what they're trying to do with weather, what's happening with the weather. Everything that man does in the world is a form of manipulating the Earth's ecosystem, and it's just a question of how much we do that impacts on a scale the magnitude of the impact that we have. So we've been creating issues with the habitat for a very long time. Now we have 8 billion people who've been used to living a certain way, and they were using the ways of this private system that hasn't been taking care of the habitat, but also it's created an opportunity for them because of the byproduct of these weather things that they could seize an opportunity utilizing these weather issues. So on the one side, it's creating a problem with the habitat, but on the other side, it's creating an ability to sort of inhabit new areas of the Earth through the changes in the weather. So this is the kind of scale we're really talking about here. I made up my mind a long time ago that I was a kamikaze musician. I sacrificed a lot to do that, to be into that place. I have no kids. I have no wife. It's like my whole thing has just been keeping up with my musical creative process. And, so to me, I'm a purist, and I'm going to have control over what I do with music. Whereas to other people, they're not like so far off onto the purest end of it. Now, I'm not saying that they're worse or better. They could be way better than I am at doing certain things with music. But what I'm saying is they were not in the super hyper totality focus, to stay into this realm of music only, which was something that I forged a pact with myself, but also my grandfather, to sort of turn my life around when I was very young, to try to be productive, to try to make something interesting for people, and to give something that would help bring stimulation to people in a good way and hopefully a positive way. That's why I chose to get involved with music. And so I've been doing a lot of things to sort of keep that all afloat, including this YouTube channel. But that's something, everything that I do, you could literally write it off, because it's all an effort to keep the creative process of music going, in the hopes that someday, that the system will have a way to facilitate, my support to do these activities. But the only way that that's supported, at least that I can see for a very long time, is through these sort of networks that are running on these sort of shady activities. So I try to steer clear of a lot of that, and I just try to keep afloat like everyone else and do my art, which is unfortunately very expensive. But I'm not a part of the music industry, and you see a lot of musicians who say that they're not really with the industry, but they're just interested in music, and so that's where I fall into that category. So I don't see any point, like I said before, in using AI to, create a composition. Whereas I can obviously see that there's a point if you're making a movie and you want to have AI do a quick score and you don't want to have to deal with all of the political issues, the economic issues, the copyright issues. You push a button, you type in some text, and you have AI take care of it. I can totally see where that's a benefit, but I can also see that there's still a boutique side to the industry. There's a cottage industry of actual diehard musicians who have always just done the commercial stuff with a grain of salt, and I'm one of those people. So I guess I'll leave it at that. That's where I stand on the udio and the suno or whatever. I can't see it like impacting, what I'm doing, because I've been creating things that nobody else gets involved with for a very long time. So if they targeted the AI directly at me and they started stealing like how I think, and which they could do, then I would be more concerned. But right now, it's just a game of creating a product to serve, racing to the bottom of the dollar, so that these guys can create, these things for cheap. But there's also the double issue of having, people do less activities in their life to reduce their imprints because of all the political stuff that's happening with the power structure.